They threw her out into the snow with nothing but a torn cloak and a heart already broken. She had refused the man her pack had chosen for her, and for that single decision, they took away her home, her family name, and every place she had ever belonged. But that night, deep inside the frozen Whitepine Forest, Elara heard something beneath the snow. A tiny cry. Then another. When she dug through the ice with her bleeding hands, she found 7 newborn wolf pups curled together beneath a fallen tree. They were freezing to death. Their mother was nowhere to be found. Elara knew she should keep walking. She knew the storm could kill her too. But she couldn't leave them. So she tore apart the only cloak she had left and wrapped all 7 pups against her body. What she didn't know was that these were not ordinary wolves. One of them wore a silver royal collar. They were the missing heirs of the most feared alpha king in the north. And before sunrise, that king would find their tracks leading straight to the woman his greatest enemy had cast away. But when he finally saw who had saved his 7 pups, he didn't order his soldiers to arrest her. He lowered his sword. Because for the first time in his life, the wolves of his kingdom had chosen someone before he had. And they had chosen the woman he had been taught to hate. The snow began falling before Elara was sent away. By the time the elders gathered in the stone courtyard, the mountain had disappeared behind a curtain of white. Snow clung to the roofs of the longhouses, covered the wooden fences, and softened the tracks of everyone who had come to watch her lose everything. Elara stood alone in the center of the courtyard. Her dark brown hair was wet from the storm, and tiny flakes rested on her lashes. Her hands were red from the cold, but she kept them folded tightly in front of her so no one would see them trembling. Across from her stood the pack elders. Behind them were dozens of wolves. Some watched her with pity. Most looked away. And beside the old stone fire stood Garran, the pack's beater, with his son Darius at his shoulder. Darius was 24, broad and proud, wearing a heavy black cloak trimmed with wolf fur. A silver chain rested across his chest, marking him as the future beater. He had expected Elara to become his mate. Everyone had. Everyone except Elara. The elder holding the ceremonial staff lifted his chin. "One final time," he said. "Do you accept the match?" Elara swallowed. The courtyard was so quiet she could hear snow landing against the firewood. "No." The word was soft. But it carried. Darius's jaw tightened. Garran's eyes hardened. The elder lowered his staff. "You understand what refusal means." Elara looked toward the mountain houses where she had spent her entire life. She saw the little window of the cottage where her grandmother had once sat beside the fire. She remembered warm bread on winter mornings, wool blankets drying near the hearth, and a hand brushing snow from her hair when she was a child. Then she looked back at Darius. "I understand." Her voice shook. "But I will not give my life to someone I fear." A murmur moved through the crowd. Darius stepped forward. "You should be grateful." Elara looked at him. "For what?" "For being chosen." His smile contained no warmth. Elara's eyes dropped for only a moment. Then she lifted them again. "I would rather be alone." That was the moment everything changed. The elder struck his staff against the stone. "Then you are no longer one of us." The word seemed to travel farther than the storm. Elara's breath caught. For a heartbeat, she thought someone would object. No one did. Not the women who had shared meals with her. Not the hunters who had known her since childhood. Not even the people who had watched her care for sick children and injured wolves. Garran turned away. Darius smiled. And the guards came for her. They took the family crest from her neck. They removed the woven bracelet her grandmother had made. Then they opened the gate. Elara stepped through. Behind her, the gate slammed shut. She stood in the snow with only a torn wool cloak around her shoulders. Inside the folds of that cloak was the only thing she had managed to keep, a small wooden charm carved by her grandmother many winters ago. Elara pressed her fingers around it. Then she walked. The storm swallowed her before she reached the edge of the village. For hours she followed the old forest path, stumbling through snow that reached her knees. The wind pushed against her so fiercely that sometimes she had to turn her face away just to breathe. She did not cry. Not at first. She simply walked. But when the last glow of the pack's fires vanished behind the trees, Her steps slowed. Elara stopped. For the first time, she allowed herself to look back. There was nothing there now. Only snow. Only darkness. She closed her eyes. Then, somewhere beneath the roar of the wind, she heard something. A faint scratching. Elara opened her eyes. She listened. There it was again. Scratch. 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 It came from beneath a fallen pine. She moved closer. The tree had been torn from the ground by the storm, leaving a hollow beneath its roots. Elara knelt and pushed away the snow with bare hands. Something moved inside. 2 pale eyes appeared. Then another. Then another. Her breath stopped. 7 tiny wolf pups were curled together beneath the roots. They were barely alive. Their fur was soaked. Their little bodies shook violently. One tried to crawl forward and collapsed. Oh, no. Elara dropped to her knees. She knew she should keep walking. She knew the storm would kill her if she stayed. But then one of the pups made a tiny sound. Not a howl. Not even a whimper. Just a weak breath that sounded almost like a question. Elara reached inside. The cold struck her fingers like knives. She pulled the first pup against her chest. Then the second. Then the third. There were 7. 7 tiny lives. She looked at her torn cloak. Then at the endless white forest. Her eyes filled with tears. You poor little things. She tore the cloak open. The sound of ripping wool disappeared beneath the wind. She wrapped the pups against her body one by one. The smallest barely moved. Elara tucked it beneath her shirt, against the warmth of her skin. Then she stood. Her legs shook. Her clothes were soaked. She was alone in the wilderness. But she began walking again. This time, she was not walking for herself. She carried the 7 pups toward an abandoned hunter's cabin hidden somewhere beyond the trees. And she had no idea that one of those pups wore a tiny silver collar. A collar bearing the royal mark of Frosthold. The kingdom ruled by the wolf king her people had been taught to hate. The abandoned cabin appeared just before dawn. Elara almost missed it. Its roof was buried beneath snow, and one wall had collapsed beneath the weight of years. But a narrow chimney still stood above the trees. She stumbled through the doorway and fell against the floor. For several seconds, she could not move. Her breath came in shallow gasps. The pups were still against her chest. 7 tiny bodies. 7 fragile heartbeats. Elara forced herself upright. The cabin smelled of old wood, dust, and frozen ashes. She cleared snow from the stone fireplace and found a few pieces of dry wood beneath a broken table. Her fingers were nearly numb. Still, she struck the flint again and again. Nothing. Again. A spark. Then another. Finally, a small flame appeared. Elara almost laughed. She gathered the flame around the wood until the fire began to crackle. Warmth slowly returned to the cabin. She placed the pups near the fire but not too close. Then she examined them. One had a cut along its ear. Another was breathing strangely. The smallest had almost stopped moving. Elara pressed 2 fingers against its chest. Nothing. Her heart dropped. No. She lifted it. She rubbed its tiny body between her palms. Nothing. She remembered her grandmother's voice from years before. Never fight the cold with panic, child. Give warmth slowly. Let the body remember how to live. Elara tucked the pup beneath her shirt. Then she wrapped her arms around it. She waited. 1 minute. 2. The fire popped. Snow tapped softly against the broken window. Elara whispered nothing. She simply held the pup. Then she felt it. A tiny movement. 1 beat. Then another. Her eyes closed. A tear slipped down her cheek. That's it. The pup breathed. Elara smiled through tears. Stay with me. She spent the entire night caring for them. She melted snow for water. She crushed dried herbs she found in an old wooden box. She warmed stones beside the fire and wrapped them in cloth. She cleaned wounds. She dried wet fur. Whenever one pup cried, she lifted it. Whenever another shivered, she brought it closer. By sunrise, the 7 were still alive. Barely, but alive. Elara leaned against the wall, exhausted. Her clothes were torn. Her hands were bleeding. Her stomach was empty. Yet when the largest pup crawled onto her lap and fell asleep against her wrist, she smiled. Outside, something moved. Elara's smile disappeared. She listened. A slow step pressed into the snow. Then another. She stood. The pups woke. The sound circled the cabin. Elara moved toward the window. Through a crack in the wooden boards, she saw a footprint. It was enormous. Much larger than the paw of any wolf she had ever seen. She stared at it. Then another appeared. And another. Someone, or something, had been walking around the cabin. Searching. Elara looked toward the pups. Her eyes fell on the smallest one's silver collar. She picked it up carefully. The mark was clear. A crown surrounded by 7 narrow lines. Frosthold. The royal house. The kingdom ruled by Kaelen, the rival king. Elara's blood ran cold. These were not wild pups. They were royal. And if someone had taken them from Frosthold, whoever was searching outside might not stop until every one of them was found. Elara gathered the pups into an old wooden crate. She had barely finished when horns sounded in the distance. Not one horn. Many. Deep notes rolled through the forest. The pups became restless. Elara stepped toward the broken doorway. Between the trees, dark figures moved through the falling snow. Riders. Armored men. At their center rode a black horse. And on its back sat a man wearing a dark cloak, his face half hidden beneath the hood. The wolves surrounding the cabin suddenly lowered their heads. Elara's heart began to pound. The rival king had come. Kaelen dismounted without speaking. Snow slid from the shoulders of his black cloak. He was younger than Elara had expected. Perhaps 30. His face was hard, but not cruel. A thin scar crossed his left eyebrow, and his dark eyes moved constantly, measuring everything around him. Behind him stood 20 royal guards. Their weapons were drawn. Kaelen looked toward the cabin. "Search it." The guards moved. Elara's heart raced. She pushed the wooden crate beneath the loose floorboards and covered it with a blanket. The pups whimpered. "Please," she whispered. Boots approached. The cabin door opened. A soldier entered. Then another. Elara stood beside the fireplace with her hands visible. The first soldier raised his sword. "Where are the pups?" Elara said nothing. The man stepped closer. Then a low growl sounded outside. Every soldier froze. Kaelen entered. A wounded white wolf stood behind him. Blood stained its side. The animal lifted its nose. It smelled the pups. Then it looked directly at Elara. Kaelen followed its gaze. His expression changed. "You." Elara remained still. "You know where they are." "I found them." Kaelen's eyes narrowed. "Where?" Elara glanced toward the floor. The king saw it. He moved forward. 2 guards immediately surrounded her. Elara stepped back. "I didn't hurt them." Kaelen stopped. "Then why are you hiding them?" "Because your soldiers were pointing swords at me." For the first time, something almost like surprise crossed his face. Then he crouched. He lifted the loose board. The 7 pups were huddled beneath it. The cabin went silent. The king stared. For several seconds, he did not move. Then the smallest pup crawled from the crate. It crossed the floor. Straight toward Elara. A second followed. Then a third. One by one, all 7 pressed themselves against her legs. Kaelen watched. The wounded white wolf behind him lowered its head. Elara slowly knelt. They were freezing. Her voice broke. "I found them under the tree." Kaelen's gaze fell to her hands. Blood covered her fingers. Not hers. The pup's wounds had stained them. He looked at her torn cloak. Then at the fire. Then at the herbs. "You kept them alive." Elara nodded. Kaelen crouched beside the smallest pup. He reached for it. The pup recoiled. But when Elara touched its back, it relaxed. Kaelen looked at her. Something in his expression softened. Only slightly. But enough. He removed his cloak and wrapped it around the smallest pup. The animal disappeared into the thick black fabric. Kaelen stood. How long have you been here? One night. Where is your pack? Elara looked toward the window. Behind me. The king understood. You were exiled. Elara said nothing. Kaelen's eyes remained on her face. You came into this forest alone. Yes. During the storm. Yes. And you stopped to save 7 wolves. Elara looked at the pups. I couldn't leave them. Kaelen studied her. For the first time, his voice lost its royal coldness. You could have died. Elara gave a small smile. So could they. Before Kaelen could answer, an arrow slammed into the wooden door. Everyone turned. A second arrow struck the wall. Kaelen drew his sword. Outside, horses screamed. The guards rushed toward the entrance. Elara instinctively covered the pups. Kaelen grabbed her arm. Down. They dropped behind the stone fireplace. More arrows struck the cabin. Then silence. Kaelen waited. 1 second. 2. 3. He slowly rose. An arrow remained lodged in the door. A piece of cloth was tied around its shaft. Kaelen pulled it free. He unfolded the cloth. His face changed. Elara saw the crest. It belonged to her former pack. Kaelen looked at her. You said you were exiled. I was. His eyes hardened. Then why are they trying to kill you? Elara had no answer. Outside, the wounded royal wolf began to growl. And somewhere beyond the trees, another wolf answered. Frosthold appeared 3 days later. It rose from the mountain like something carved directly from the ice. Black stone walls climbed toward the clouds. Tall towers pierced the snowy sky, their roofs covered in silver frost. Huge banners bearing the royal wolf crest moved in the wind. Elara stared as the gates opened. She had grown up hearing stories about this kingdom. Stories meant to frighten children. Stories about Kaelen, the ruthless rival king. The wolf king who never forgave an enemy. But none of the stories had mentioned the quiet way he carried a sleeping pup against his chest. Inside Frosthold, servants rushed toward them. Doctors, guards, healers. The 7 pups were taken to a warm chamber. Elara followed. A royal healer examined them and looked stunned. They should not have survived. Elara stood beside the table. They did. The healer looked at her. Because of you. Before Elara could respond, the chamber doors opened. Several nobles entered. Their expressions were cold. A woman wearing a silver crown pointed toward Elara. She is from the mountain pack. Kaelen stood behind her. I know. Then she cannot remain here. Elara lowered her eyes. The words hurt less than they should have. She had heard them before. Leave. You don't belong. You're not one of us. Kaelen's voice came quietly. She stays. The room went silent. The Queen Mother stared at him. Kaelen. She saved the heirs. She is our enemy. Kaelen looked toward the 7 pups. They don't seem to know that. No one answered. Elara was given a small chamber near the nursery. That first night, she expected the pups to sleep with the royal healers. Instead, sometime after midnight, she woke to scratching at her door. She opened it. 7 small bodies entered. They climbed onto her bed. One curled against her feet. Another rested beside her hand. The smallest crawled beneath her arm. Elara stared at them. Then she laughed softly. For the first time since her banishment, she felt something warm inside her chest. Not happiness. Not yet. Something smaller. Belonging. Days passed. The pups grew stronger. Elara helped feed them. She learned their different personalities. The smallest was gentle. The largest was stubborn. One always slept beside the fireplace. Another followed Elara everywhere. Kaelen noticed. He said nothing. But sometimes Elara would find him standing in the doorway, watching. Their conversations were brief. Yet each one mattered. One evening, a storm shook Frosthold. Thunder rolled across the mountains. The pups panicked. Elara gathered them close. She sat on the floor while lightning flashed beyond the windows. Kaelen stood in the doorway. You aren't afraid? Elara looked at the trembling pups. I am. He glanced at her. Then why aren't you shaking? She smiled faintly. Because they're watching me. Kaelen looked at the pups. Something changed in his eyes. He understood. She wasn't fearless. She simply refused to let fear make her useless. That night, he stayed outside the nursery until the storm passed. But the next morning, a royal guard arrived with terrible news. A spy had been captured near the eastern wall. And before he was brought into the throne room, he had said one name. Garran. The beater who had banished Elara. The same man who had tried to force her into marriage. The same man whose crest had appeared on the arrows in the forest. Elara's face went pale. Her exile had not been punishment. It had been preparation. Someone had wanted her far away from the mountain pack. Far away from the pups. Far away from the truth. And now Kaelen knew exactly where to begin looking. The investigation changed Frosthold. Every corridor seemed quieter. Every guard watched the shadows. Kaelen sent riders into the mountains while messengers crossed the borders between the rival kingdoms. Elara remained with the pups. But one evening, an old royal historian came to the nursery carrying a book bound in cracked white leather. He placed it on the table. The 7 pups are not simply heirs, he said. Elara opened the book. Inside was an ancient painting. 7 white wolves stood beneath a silver moon. At their feet stood a woman. Not a queen. Not a warrior. A woman with empty hands. Elara looked closer. The historian touched the faded words beneath the painting. The old bloodline. He explained that centuries earlier, 7 royal wolves had been born during the longest winter in the kingdom's history. Their bloodline was believed to carry the ancient spirit of unity, but the prophecy had never said the ruler would be chosen by birth. It said the ruler would be recognized by the 7 wolves. And the 7 would follow the one who protected the helpless when no one was watching. Elara stared at the pups. The smallest lifted its head. The historian whispered that whoever controlled the pups could influence the future of every wolf kingdom. That was why someone had tried to kill them. That was why Elara had been removed. Garran had known. He had wanted Darius to control the bloodline. But there was something Garran had not understood. The pups had already chosen. Elara closed the book. Outside, the wind began to rise. Far beyond Frosthold, an army was moving. Garran had gathered men. And he was coming for the pups. The attack began during a blizzard. The first warning was not a horn. It was silence. The wolves outside Frosthold stopped howling. Then an arrow struck the eastern tower. Another. Then dozens. Guards rushed to the walls. Kaelen entered the nursery. Stay here. Elara looked at him. What is happening? His face was grim. Garran. The fortress shook. Somewhere below, a gate splintered. The pups began crying. Kaelen looked at Elara. Take them to the lower chamber. And you. I'll hold the walls. Elara wanted to say something. Instead, she nodded. She gathered the pups. They ran through the stone corridors as soldiers shouted above them. Smoke filled the air. The nursery doors shook. Elara reached the underground chamber and closed the iron door. The pups huddled around her. Then came a terrible sound. Stone cracking. Elara looked upward. Dust fell from the ceiling. The fortress had been struck. Again. The ceiling collapsed. Elara threw herself over the pups. Snow and stone crashed around them. Darkness swallowed everything. She could not move. Pain burned through her shoulder. Her breath came fast. The pups were beneath her. Alive. She pressed herself over them. Stay quiet. Above them, distant fighting continued. Kaelen was still somewhere in the fortress. A few minutes later, Elara heard footsteps. Then a voice. Garran's men are retreating. Another voice answered. Find the pups. Elara closed her eyes. She understood. Garran had failed to capture Frosthold. Now he wanted to kill the heirs before he escaped. She held the pups tighter. Then she heard something else. Kaelen. His voice came from somewhere beyond the collapsed stones. Elara. She tried to answer. Nothing came out. She was running out of air. Above, Kaelen had reached the final chamber. His soldiers were dragging away the last of Garran's men. One of them shouted that Garran was escaping through the western pass. Kaelen looked toward the mountains. Then he heard it. A faint sound. A tiny howl. He turned. Another howl answered. Then another. 7. Kaelen's face changed. He abandoned the western pass. He ran toward the rubble. Move the stones. The soldiers began digging. One stone. Then another. Snow poured into the chamber. Kaelen tore at the debris with his bare hands. Blood appeared beneath his fingernails. He did not stop. Then one soldier froze. King. Kaelen looked up. From beneath the rubble came another sound. 7 tiny howls. Alive. Kaelen broke through the final layer of stone. Cold air rushed into the chamber. Elara lay beneath the rubble. Her body was curled around the 7 pups. Her face was pale. Her shoulder was bleeding. But when Kaelen reached her, her eyes opened. She looked at him. Then at the pups. Are they alive? Kaelen stared at her. Even now. Even after everything. That was her first question. He nodded. All 7. Elara closed her eyes. A breath escaped her. Not fear. Relief. Kaelen reached for her. She tried to stand. Her legs failed. He caught her before she hit the ground. For several seconds, neither moved. Around them, soldiers watched silently. The feared king was holding the woman his enemies had cast away. And she was holding one of the pups against her chest. Kaelen carried her from the chamber. The 7 pups followed. Above them, Frosthold had survived. The attack was over. Garran had been captured before he reached the mountain pass. Darius was found with him. The evidence was undeniable. Letters. Orders. Seals. The ambush that had killed members of Kaelen's royal party had been arranged by Garran. The attempt to control the 7 pups had been part of the same plan. And Elara's banishment had been deliberate. Garran had known that she would never allow innocent lives to be sacrificed. He had known she would stand against him. So he had removed her. He had believed exile would make her powerless. Instead, it had placed her exactly where the 7 pups needed her. Days later, the rulers of both kingdoms gathered inside Frosthold. The great hall was filled with people who had once called each other enemies. Elara stood before them. She could have asked for Garran's death. She could have demanded that Darius lose everything. Instead, she asked for something different. No one should be forced into a life they did not choose. Her voice echoed beneath the stone ceiling. Not because they are weak. Not because they are afraid. But because a person's heart should never be treated like property. The hall became silent. Kaelen stood behind her. Then he stepped forward. He ordered the ancient forced matching law abolished. The decree was signed before every kingdom leader. The tradition that had broken Elara's life would never break another. Garran was stripped of his title. Darius was banished. And Elara's family name was restored. But she did not return to the mountain pack. She had changed. The girl who had once stood outside the gates waiting for someone to tell her she belonged somewhere was gone. In her place stood a woman who knew belonging could not be begged for. It had to be built. Kaelen offered her a place at Frosthold. Not as a servant. Not as a political symbol. As guardian of the 7 royal wolves. She accepted. The years that followed changed both kingdoms. The 7 pups grew. Their fur became bright as winter moonlight. They became powerful white wolves, each carrying the ancient bloodline through the mountains. But no matter how large they became, they never forgot Elara. When she walked through the courtyard, they followed. When she sat beside the fire, they slept near her feet. And when Kaelen approached, the largest wolf would sometimes lift its head and watch him carefully before settling down again. Kaelen would smile. Elara would pretend not to notice. Their love did not arrive like thunder. It grew quietly. In shared meals. In long walks through the snowy forest. In mornings when the mountains turned gold beneath the sunrise. in the simple comfort of knowing someone would still be there when the storm came. Years later, Frosthold hosted the first peaceful gathering between the two kingdoms. For generations, their people had lived behind borders made from fear. That day, children crossed them freely. They ran through the snow. They laughed. And the 7 great white wolves moved among them without fear. Elara stood on the fortress steps. Beside her stood Kaelen. Below them, a little girl reached toward one of the wolves. The great animal lowered its head. The child touched its fur. Nothing happened. No growl. No fear. Only trust. Elara watched with tears in her eyes. Kaelen looked at her. You changed everything. She shook her head. No. Her gaze returned to the wolves. They did. The smallest of the 7, now grown into a magnificent white wolf, lifted its head toward her. For a moment, Elara remembered that terrible night. The snow. The hunger. The loneliness. The gate closing behind her. She remembered walking into the forest believing she had lost her family. Believing she had lost her future. Believing rejection meant she was worth less. Then she remembered 7 tiny bodies beneath the roots of a fallen tree. 7 lives she could have ignored. 7 hearts she could have left to the cold. But she had stopped. She had torn apart the only thing she owned to keep them warm. She had risked her life for creatures who could give her nothing in return. And somehow, that single act had opened a door to a life she never could have imagined. A home. A kingdom. A family. A man who had once been her enemy and had become the person who stood beside her when the world turned cold. Elara looked across the peaceful valley. Snow began falling again. Softly this time. Beautifully. The children kept playing. The wolves moved through the crowd like pale shadows beneath the winter sun. And for the first time, snow did not mean exile. It meant home. Because sometimes the door that closes behind you is not the end of your story. Sometimes it is the beginning. Sometimes the people who cast you out believe they are taking everything from you. But they cannot take the kindness inside you. They cannot take the courage to protect something weaker than yourself. And they cannot know where one selfless choice might lead. Elara had walked into the snow with nothing but a torn cloak. She had expected to disappear. Instead, 7 fragile lives had found her. And in saving them, she had found herself. Not the girl the mountain pack wanted her to become. Not the obedient bride they tried to create. But the woman who stood beneath the winter sky knowing exactly who she was. The guardian of 7 wolves. The bridge between 2 kingdoms. And, at last, someone who had found a family that never asked her to become smaller in order to belong. The snow continued to fall. The 7 white wolves stood around her. And far beyond the mountains, for the first time in generations, no kingdom raised its weapons. Only the sound of wolves filled the valley. Not a warning. Not a cry of war. A song of peace.